Most people imagine that the people of the Middle Ages were simply careless about cleanliness, as if medieval society ignored hygiene out of laziness or ignorance. But the unsettling truth is far stranger and far more revealing. Because in the year 1348, many Europeans believed that washing your entire body in hot water could quite literally kill you. And this belief was not a superstition whispered in the shadows, but a widely accepted medical warning repeated by physicians, priests, and scholars alike, rooted in the terrifying reality that an invisible catastrophe was already unfolding across Europe. In a world trembling under the shadow of the Black Death, the human body was imagined as a fortress whose walls were the skin itself, and anything that softened or opened those walls was seen as a fatal invitation to the deadly vapors thought to drift invisibly through the air. If you had stepped into a modest home in medieval London or York on a cold gray morning, you would not hear the rush of water filling a bath or see steam rising from a heated tub, because such an act would have been considered reckless. Instead, the ritual of cleanliness began with restraint rather than immersion. A person might rise from a bed stuffed with straw and feathers, the air inside the room heavy with the stale warmth of bodies and the faint, musty smell of rushes scattered across the floor to absorb dirt and moisture, some of which had not been replaced for months. From a small wooden basin, a piece of rough linen would be dipped briefly into cold water and passed across the face and hands, the sensation sharp and bracing against the skin. That brief wipe was often the full extent of contact with water for the day. To modernize, this seems shocking, but within the logic of medieval medicine, it was a rational defense. According to the prevailing theory of miasma, disease floated through the air as poisonous vapors, and hot baths were believed to open the pores of the skin like gates in a castle wall, allowing those invisible poisons to enter the body. Dirt, by contrast, was not merely tolerated, but sometimes understood as a protective barrier. A thin film of grime could be interpreted as a kind of sealant, a shield against infection. This mindset shaped not only personal habits, but the entire sensory environment of daily life. The scent of cleanliness was rarely the smell of soap. Instead, it was the layered fragrance of herbs and perfumes used to mask the constant presence of sweat and smoke. Rosemary, lavender, and dried flowers were carried in small bundles or tucked into clothing, while wealthier individuals used rosewater and musk to overwhelm the heavier odors of crowded medieval living. Even the aristocracy, who possessed far more resources than peasants, did not rely primarily on bathing for hygiene. Their strategy centered on linen. Fine white linen undergarments were believed to absorb impurities from the skin, functioning almost like a sponge that pulled toxins out through perspiration. Changing linen frequently became a visible symbol of refinement and health. A nobleman might replace his shirt multiple times a day, believing the crisp fabric itself was cleansing his body without the danger of water. The whiteness of the cloth, visible at the collar or cuffs, signaled both wealth and cleanliness in a society where bathing was approached with caution. Yet while the upper classes managed their hygiene through linen and perfume, the broader reality of medieval sanitation was far harsher, particularly in growing urban centers where population density pressed human life into tight, crowded spaces. And when you step beyond the walls of private homes and into the living machinery of a medieval city, the full weight of this system becomes impossible to ignore. Because the absence of modern sanitation was not a small inconvenience, but a defining feature of daily life, shaping how people moved, breathed, worked, and even thought about their own bodies. In 14th century London, the streets were narrow corridors of timber houses leaning toward each other like tired shoulders, their upper floors extending outward so closely that in some alleys, neighbors could nearly touch across the gap. This architecture, designed to maximize space inside crowded city walls, created long channels where sunlight struggled to reach the ground, and where the air hung heavy with layers of smell that no breeze could easily carry away. The ground beneath your feet would rarely be dry. Rain mixed with mud, animal droppings, spilled food, and whatever waste people emptied from their homes, forming a shifting paste that clung to boots and seeped between the stones. It is important to understand that none of this was accidental neglect. It was the natural outcome of a city growing faster than its infrastructure could possibly manage. Medieval cities had no underground sewage systems, no flushing toilets, and no municipal waste treatment. Instead, waste moved through gravity, buckets, and human labor, and each of those methods had limits that were constantly being tested by the swelling population. Even in the grand castles of the nobility, sanitation relied on surprisingly simple mechanisms. The toilet, known as a garderobe, was often a stone seat built into an exterior wall, with a vertical shaft dropping waste directly into a moat or cesspit below. The system required no plumbing, only height. Gravity carried everything downward, where the contents accumulated until they were eventually removed. Yet even this unpleasant arrangement had practical side effects. The fumes rising from these pits contained ammonia strong enough to kill insects, which meant the garderobe chambers sometimes doubled as places to store valuable clothing. Fine garments could hang there, protected from fleas and moths by the very smell that made visitors recoil. What appears today as crude improvisation was, in its own strange way, a calculated adaptation to the limitations of the time. Outside the walls of castles, the situation became far chaotic. Most urban households relied on simple chamber pots or wooden buckets. At the end of the day, their contents were carried outside and dumped into open drains or pits. In theory, laws regulated where waste could be thrown, but in practice, enforcement was inconsistent. The result was a city that constantly produced more refuse than it could easily remove. Here, another profession quietly emerged, one so unpleasant that it was performed almost entirely in darkness. These workers were known as gong farmers. Their task was to descend into the cesspits beneath houses and streets and remove the accumulated waste by hand. They worked only at night, partly to spare others the sight and smell, and partly because the work itself carried enormous risk. The pits were deep, damp cavities where toxic gases collected. A single breath of concentrated fumes could suffocate a man within seconds. Yet, despite the danger, the work had to be done, because without these laborers, the city would drown in its own waste. It was brutal labor, carried out by people whose names rarely appear in the historical record, yet their quiet endurance kept entire urban populations functioning. Above ground, the city attempted to fight filth with a mixture of rules and improvisation. Officials hired muckrakers to scrape debris from the streets, but their efforts were constantly undone by the daily flood of new refuse. In reality, one of the most effective sanitation systems was animal behavior. Pigs roamed freely in many medieval towns, consuming discarded food scraps and organic waste. These animals acted as living garbage processors, reducing piles of refuse that might otherwise rot in place. But their presence introduced another layer of mess as the animals themselves left droppings behind. The street became a complex ecosystem where human waste, animal waste, food scraps, mud, and rain blended together into an environment that modern visitors would find overwhelming. Travelers who recorded their impressions often described the smell of medieval cities not as a single odor, but as a force, something almost physical that struck the senses upon arrival.
And so, when modern people imagine the Middle Ages as simply dirty or primitive, they often miss the deeper truth hidden inside these uncomfortable details. Because the story of medieval hygiene is not really about neglect at all, but about adaptation inside a world where technology, knowledge, and infrastructure had very strict limits. The people who lived in those narrow streets and smoky rooms were not indifferent to cleanliness, nor were they unaware of discomfort. They felt the same human desire for freshness, relief, and health that people feel today. The difference was that they had to pursue those goals with tools and ideas that belonged to their time. Herbal perfumes masked odors because soap was rare. Linen clothing absorbed sweat because frequent bathing was feared. Waste was managed through gravity, animals, and dangerous manual labor because plumbing systems did not yet exist. Every solution was imperfect, yet each one represented an attempt to impose some order on a difficult environment. And when you consider the physical reality of their lives, the effort required to maintain even a basic level of stability becomes clearer. Imagine rising each morning in a cold house, stepping onto a floor layered with rushes and dust, breathing air thick with smoke from a hearth that never fully cleared the room, then walking out into streets already churned into mud by hundreds of feet and hooves. Food had to be earned through hard labor, water could not always be trusted, and disease might appear without warning. Yet despite these pressures, medieval communities continued to function. Markets opened, churches held services, craftsmen worked their trades, farmers planted and harvested according to the seasons, cities expanded, cathedrals were built, and trade networks stretched across continents. The endurance required to sustain such a society under those conditions was immense, though it rarely appears heroic in the way modern stories prefer. Instead, it was quiet and repetitive. It lived in the daily routines that people performed without recognition, washing hands in cold basins, changing linen shirts, burning herbs to sweeten the air, digging pits, carrying buckets, clearing streets, and cooking food that would sustain another day of labor. These actions were not dramatic, but they were essential. They allowed communities to survive in a world that constantly tested the limits of human resilience. When we look back now, it is easy to focus on the discomfort, the smells, or the strange medical beliefs that shaped medieval hygiene. But beneath those surface details lies something more revealing about human history. Civilization does not depend solely on grand inventions or sudden breakthroughs. For long stretches of time, it depends on ordinary people continuing to adapt, adjust, and endure within systems that are far from perfect. The Middle Ages were one of those periods where survival was maintained through thousands of small adjustments rather than one great solution. And once you begin to see the era through that lens, the image of medieval life changes. What first appears as chaos or filth becomes evidence of a society doing its best to live within the limits of its knowledge and environment. In that sense, the streets of medieval England were not merely dirty places. They were living systems, sustained by the quiet persistence of people who understood that comfort might be rare, but survival was always worth the effort.